Good afternoon. Good afternoon, and welcome to this panel discussion on what the future might hold between the West and Russia on the issue of Ukraine. Much of the popular discourse in Washington is focused on two questions. Why are the Russians massing such large military forces near Ukraine? And what should the United States do to prevent an invasion? What I'd like to do today is something a little bit different. Rather than looking at the present situation and asking our panelists to prescribe what Washington should do, I've asked them to begin with the future and to work backwards. I've laid out for them three broad alternative future scenarios and asked them what would have to happen to bring those alternative futures about. The first scenario I call the fundamental improvement in the situation, some kind of broad diplomatic agreement among all the concerned parties, the United States, Russia, Ukraine, and other European states. Some way they could manage their differences in a way that they all consider legitimate. The second scenario I called a rapid deterioration, which would involve some kind of major military operation. And the third I called muddling through, or stasis, which I described as kind of a no war, no peace scenario, where the big issues about Ukraine's place in the broader European security architecture are unresolved, but Russia still elects, for whatever reason, to demobilize its forces near Ukraine. So I want to ask our panelists to begin with that third scenario, muddling through. It seems to me that much of the conventional wisdom in Washington these days about what to do about the tensions with Russia over Ukraine are designed toward achieving that outcome, that muddling through, to get the Russians to demobilize and back off of any threat of invasion, but at the same time to postpone any fundamental decisions about NATO expansion, about the shape of the European order and Ukraine's place in it. So panelists, do any of you see this as a realistic possible scenario? If so, what would have to happen to bring it about? And if not, why do you think it's not feasible? I want to start with Anatol Lieven. Anatol.
Thank you so much, George. Thank you for inviting me. And I think you're absolutely right about the Biden administration. This is its plan or hope to kick this can down the road. But I don't think that that's going to work, because from a Russian point of view, this is exactly what the West has been doing for the past 7 years. In other words, drawing up the Minsk agreement on autonomy for the Donbass, but not doing anything, actually to implement it or to put pressure on the Ukrainians, making declarative statements about, the need for Ukraine to be a multi-ethnic democracy, but not backing this up with any kind of actual pressure or sanctions on Ukraine. And of course, going back beyond that, an approach to talks with Russia, which basically consisted of Russia on one side of the table and all the members of NATO on the other, having made a decision already and then presenting it to Russia as a fait accompli. Now, if you read or listen to what both Putin and former President Medvedev and others, and Lavrov and other senior Russian officials have been saying, for a number of years after 2014, there was this feeling in Moscow that Ukraine was not going to join the West. It wasn't going to be invited to join NATO because of the unsolved issues of Crimea and the Donbass. It wasn't going to join the European Union in any foreseeable future because it's just not in an economic position to do so. And therefore, that over time, as seen from Moscow, sensible voices in Ukraine would prevail. And without, coming back to alliance with Russia or any kind of new union, you would have a Ukrainian government that would seek good relations with Russia again, would restore economic relations, would back off from Ukrainianization, and would negotiate a deal on for autonomy on the Donbass within Ukraine. But what has happened, I think, is two things. One is that US military aid to Ukraine, as Putin said, has created this impression in Russia that Ukraine can become, a major non-NATO ally of the United States. But the second thing that has really rattled the Russians has been these greatly intensified moves towards Ukrainianization within Ukraine. Limits on the Russian language, moves even to abolish the use of the Russian language in widespread areas of government and education and culture. Because from a Russian point of view, and once again, I'm just, putting the Russia's perspective on this, and explaining why I don't think that they will accept the muddling through scenario. This risks destroying the historical and cultural basis of the Ukrainian-Russian relationship, on which, if once again one reads Putin's essay from last summer, Russian confidence in the long-term relationship with Ukraine was founded. So I think there has been a real change this year. The Russians used to think that time was on their side over Ukraine. Now they no longer think that. And therefore, to say to them, oh, we can just wait and let this go on and muddle through, no, I don't think that will work again.
Any other comments on this question from other panelists? Okay. It sounds like we're in agreement that a muddling through approach is very unlikely to occur. Let me turn to the war scenario and ask Doug Macgregor to comment on this. Doug, you're about as expert as anybody in our country on military matters. You've taught them at West Point. You've been an advisor, senior advisor in the Pentagon, and you have actually seen war on the battlefield. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on what might trigger a war scenario of some kind. How might it go? And in particular, one of the things I see in a lot of Washington commentary is the belief that the Russians would be quite likely to bog down, that this could turn into a quagmire with guerrilla operations mounted by Ukrainians that would make it hard for the Russians to control, hold, and pacify parts of Ukraine, or all of Ukraine should it choose to invade Ukraine as a whole. Could you comment on your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll certainly try. As far as triggers are concerned, I'm going to set that aside for a moment, because there are any number of things that could occur, barring obviously any of the positive steps that Anatol outlined. I think it's fairly certain that Mr. Putin will feel compelled to intervene in eastern Ukraine. So the question is, as far as I'm concerned, regardless of what trigger beyond the obvious failure to accommodate Russian national security interests, is what will this look like? And so I'm going to offer some assumptions up front that I think Mr. Putin would have discussed with Shoigu and others on the National Defense Council and the Stavka. I think it's very clear that he wants an offensive into the country to be decisive, but still limited. That means that operations are likely to be limited to the Russified areas of Ukraine, to those areas where the majority is Russian speaking. I see no evidence that he will press into the heartland of Ukraine, where the Ukrainian population is incurably hostile to Russia. Secondly, I think he wants something that will compel the Ukrainians, who do not have inexhaustible resources, to fight in multiple directions at once. He's got to achieve his operational objectives quickly. Those operational objectives are largely along the Dnieper River. The notion of going in and securing Luhansk or Donetsk is ridiculous and a waste of time, changes nothing, and puts him in the position of having to defend these small areas almost in perpetuity. Finally, I think he's looking at a broad front, because he wants people to guess where he's actually going to go. And when he does advance, they'll advance on multiple axes with a variety of forces backed by enormous firepower, the striking power of rocket artillery groups, tactical ballistic missiles, aircraft, and so forth. And then finally, I think he wants to limit destruction to the extent that he can, This is not someone who wants a scorched earth offensive by any means. However, he is not going to allow anything to slow him down, because in his judgment, that would be suicidal. So he's likely to bypass any hard resistance that he finds first and then deal with that later, but he's got to reach the upper river line. The only possibility is that they could advance on Odessa, but that seems unlikely in this phase. That's probably, in his view, a bridge too far. But if he can reach the upper river line from south of Kiev down to Crimea, that would give him the depth and what he would regard as the buffer strategically that he wants. And how this will occur, there will not be a huge long-term firepower demonstration that you would see with the Americans. It will be short, sharp, and decisive. He will target anything that he thinks can interfere with that offensive. Any hint that the Ukrainians on the west side of the Dnieper will use assess elements or capabilities and assets there against him, they will be destroyed. He will not limit his actions exclusively in terms of strike and ISR just to eastern Ukraine. But as far as maneuver forces on the ground are concerned, he will try to reach that Dnieper river line very, very quickly, and then essentially declare a fait accompli. And it's a matter of debate as to how much resistance he would meet from the population. There are those who think he'd meet none or some, but not a great deal. And we have to keep in mind the levels of corruption in that part of the world. He may advance in some areas without any resistance at all. So that in outline is what it would look like. And I think that's broad terms, the kind of guidance that he's given the general staff. So I think you'll see a force that is probably closer to 200,000 than what you see today. He will have a considerable depth in terms of reserves and more strike forces that will be added to the theater. Finally, he will have forces north of Kiev, and he'll have forces poised, if necessary, if he sees any evidence of the West moving anything towards the Ukrainian border, he will ultimately go to Brest, because from that position, he can threaten everything in the Baltic states and Poland and make it clear to us that to move into Ukraine would be disastrous. But that will only occur if he sees a response from us that is serious.
Cynthia Roberts, professor of political science, Hunter College. You have a great deal of expertise in the area of financial statecraft. The United States has made clear that should the Russians engage in some kind of an invasion, a large-scale military operation against Ukraine, that we would impose draconian sanctions, what some officials have called the sanctions from hell, on the Russians, some of which we've made very clear what they would be. Others we've been somewhat vague in our public discourse about them. I want to ask you about how that kind of scenario might play out. Should there be an invasion? Should there be a set of draconian Western sanctions on the Russian economy? What kind of reaction might we expect from the Russians, first of all? And second of all, could this have secondary or tertiary effects beyond just Russia that we ought to be considering as we think about how this might play out?
Well, thank you also for having me here. Yes, the US has expertly developed targeted sanctions to punish what it conceives of bad actors, but they're a weak coercive tool. So that's the first problem. And the US, it's not clear, has thought through escalatory risks associated with those kinds of draconian sanctions. And meanwhile, autocrats who have long engaged in coup proofing are now engaging in global sanctions proofing, and that includes especially Russia and China. So the US would obviously hope to cut off, in its most draconian sanctions, cut off Russia from all international transactions. That's what would be accomplished if they cut Russia off from SWIFT, which is the network used to connect the 1,100 plus banks in over 200 countries. This would mostly affect Russian transactions with Germany and the US and other countries, but it would probably have less an impact than the SWIFT cutoff from Iran, because Russia has a different economic position. It has very large reserves, over $625 billion in gold and dollars and euros and other currencies. And the Russians have been, as I said, sanction proofing their financial system. So they would definitely take a big hit. There's no question that the US hopes for triggering currency volatility, causing massive capital outflows, would occur also with Russia. Although the Russians have built their own SWIFT, it's principally for domestic use. It accounts now for about 20% of Russian transactions. It doesn't involve foreign actors, unlike the more developed Chinese version of SWIFT. And it would be interesting to see if the Russians would require the remaining foreign banks operating in the country to join the Russian SWIFT, and whether the Chinese would cooperate. Only one Chinese bank now, the Bank of China, is connected to the Russian equivalent of the SWIFT. So there would definitely be an initial hit. It would have an impact for sure, and very punishing. But let's also remember, besides its large bank reserves, Russia owns much of its own debt. Its credit position is good. And the United States would aim to make it harder and more costly for the Russians to engage in selling its debt on the international system. It's worth also going back and looking how the US had expanded sanctions already in the Biden administration in April of last year for previous issues, foreign election interference, the SolarWinds cyber attack, and also the annexation of Crimea. And in that sense, the US has already blocked American participants in buying Russian sovereign debt. So it's already attacked the Russian central bank, but it allowed secondary transactions to take place. And it's unclear whether that secondary debt market would survive in the new wave of sanctions. It's about a total of $185 billion. About 25% is held by foreign investors, and US investors through the secondary markets make up about half of those holdings. But as I said, Russia is not in desperate need to sell its currency, so it could absorb these shocks. And let's remember, Putin and his generation have been through 4 previous shocks, including and most notably the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Soviet economy, which would probably be ranked as much worse than what the US will do. But then what would be the consequences beyond the economic hit? And here, sanctions have a very poor coercive track record. I don't think it would have, if it doesn't deter Putin in the first place, it's unlikely US sanctions, even combined with Europe, and it's not clear how far the Europeans will go, it's unlikely to pressure Putin to back down. I think it's perhaps more likely that it will incentivize the Kremlin to retaliate. And there are a number of horizontal moves they could take that they might consider proportionate. Cyber attacks come to mind most often. They could either let hackers like the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack be sponsored or indirectly sponsored by the Kremlin, or the Kremlin could directly respond and try to rally around the flag, maybe with an infrastructure attack in the middle of winter, target heating on the East Coast. So on the one hand, you have the Russians trying to shield their economy, just as the Chinese are doing, collaborating with others to work around the value or the impact of US sanctions. And on the second hand, we have to consider the possibility of retaliation. Over the longer term, the last thing I would say is there's bound to be increasing blowback. We already see the impact of these countries like China and Russia especially, but not just them, India as well, concerned about the US overusing and weaponizing the dominance of the dollar. And this will just encourage others besides Russia to harden their economies, and possibly we'll see an impact on financial markets. Let's not forget, in some of the sanctions, the US has had to backtrack, for example, on Rusal because of financial markets. So this has to be another concern of the Treasury. But all three of these, the escalatory risks, the fact it's not likely to get Russian compliance, and that there will be even more blowback in the world economy in terms of questioning the dominant role of the US dollar, not immediately, but over time, is something to consider.
Thank you, Cynthia. I want to turn to Matt Burrows. Matt, of the Atlantic Council, you spent much of your career in what I might call the futures business. You were on the National Intelligence Council and were the driving force behind the NIC's global futures exercises for very many years. Extremely difficult thing to do, but I want to ask you to put your futures hat on here for a minute and look at the broader world order sometime down the road, assuming that we're in that war scenario, and Doug is correct that this is quick and decisive and fundamentally changes the situation inside Ukraine. What are the implications of that kind of scenario for the broader world order, looking at relationships between Russia and China, the United States and Europe, and the broader balance within the world?
Well, thanks, George, and thanks for inviting me to participate. I guess the first, I think the first thing that Russia will do in a geopolitical sense is what they did after Crimea, which was to reach out and try to get China on its side. And obviously, I think China wants to provide some support, but it puts actually the Chinese in a difficult position because, February is the beginning of the Beijing Winter Olympics. Putin is supposed to go there. How are Chinese obviously in Xi, this is a very important year for Xi because he's going to, at the end of the year, looking forward to getting this historic third term. But you may have a disaster with the Beijing Winter Olympics, which I think would be actually embarrassing for the regime. So that's one thing. I think the other thing that people are considering is, is this going to be a coordinated thing between Putin and Xi, where Xi makes a move on Taiwan to kind of cement his legacy. I tend to be doubtful, but I think there is an importance here. I think Xi and other Chinese leaders are going to look to see how this plays out. I think particularly, what sort of pain that Russia would have to absorb. Now, obviously, the Chinese, much more integrated, dependent on trade, are much more vulnerable in that sense than the Russians are. But if the Russians manage, as I think Cynthia has persuasively suggested here, manage to actually get through this without major damage, particularly to the survivability of the Putin regime, then it does open the door, I think, in their mind to maybe, a aggressive move on Taiwan is something that that actually is thinkable, is possible. I think, when the other thing that we haven't mentioned here on a geopolitical level is, Europe's dependence on Russian gas. And obviously in the long term, you know, if Russia would cut off in response to sanctions, and this is probably a question as to how much Europe goes along with US sanctions. But if Russia would cut off that gas, I mean, there are huge number of, particularly in the Central and Eastern Europe, that are highly dependent, and in the Balkans. Western Europe a little bit less, but I mean, this in the middle of winter, not sure if it's going to be you know, if we will have really cold temperatures in Europe, that could be then cause, you know, the US, then a question for the US of how to help. And if the US doesn't seem to come through, that also, I think, has implications for transatlantic relationships. And also if the Europeans, you know, make a move to, you know, not go along with US sanctions, be a little bit more tempered in their obviously condemnation of any Russian invasion. I think then you also introduce some perhaps discordance in the transatlantic relationship. So that I think is going to be an important, you know, question. I think it is in the Russian interest not to cut those ties, because obviously then you become seen as this highly unreliable, which, you know, they all already have. There's some questions raised this winter when they're not supplying as much gas as the Europeans have wanted. You know, on the broader global stage, I don't see this as you know, being the trigger for pushing us all the way into a bifurcated world. I mean, there's lots of talk in Washington about a new Cold War. There's some people that are anxious to have it. There are a lot of talking about decoupling, but you know, the big dynamic there is between the US and China. And as I said, I think at this point, you know, China doesn't want to go whole hog and break off. It's obviously, as Cynthia was saying, I mean, it's thinking about, like on computer chips, how do you make yourself much more self-sufficient and not dependent on the US. They are not quite there. It'd be another 5-10 years on some of these technologies. But, you know, when you think back to the First World War and the lead up to the First World War, there were a number of different incidents that basically didn't, other than Sarajevo, didn't trigger the beginning of a First World War, but made it more likely. And I think here you can think this is an Agadir or some other crisis in which the Chinese think, you know, the US is really going to now go after them after, you know, if this is, particularly if this is successful in punishing Russia and getting Russia maybe to back down. I mean, that would be real worry on Chinese, or the opposite, which is that it turns out to be really a US not being successful in pushing back on Russia, and then in empowering or motivating China to take a lot more aggressive action. So I think that is the real question here is, you know, what are the perceptions in Beijing and Washington after this begins? We see much more of the effects of this. And does that mean that, you know, either side is more interested in really cutting ties and getting us into a new Cold War or bifurcated world?
Okay, very quickly, I'd like to circle to the third scenario, improvement, and talk a little bit about how that might come about, what might have to happen for that to be realistic. And I want to ask Anatol Lieven. Anatol, you've written quite eloquently at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft about ways out of the situation that we find ourselves in right now. What might that path look like?
I think it would have to involve neutrality for Ukraine. Now, something which has never been noticed in the West is that neutrality for Ukraine, after all, given the Russian government's position as of 2013, is a huge blow to Russia as well, because of course, as with Finland, as with Austria, this also implies that Ukraine cannot join a Russian alliance or any kind of union with Russia. So this would be something that really destroys whatever remaining hopes there are in Russia, and I don't think they're at all great, of turning the Eurasian Union into a serious international bloc. So I think that is really the only way out now. I mean, perhaps the Russians would settle for, given all the economic threats that we've heard of to Russia, if they do invade, I mean, perhaps the Russians would accept, stronger guarantees of no new stationing of NATO troops, for example. But if we want actually to solve this crisis and eliminate the constant and continual threat of future crises, then I think it has to be a combination of neutrality with autonomy for the Donbass within Ukraine, guaranteed under international agreements. By the way, I agree completely with everything that Doug said about what Russia will do militarily if it does go to war. I agree. I don't think that there would be any point in Russia engaging in half measures. On the other hand, I think it's worth saying that in my view and my information, Russia would not seek to annex more territory to Russia. What it would do is it would occupy territory and then it would actually declare itself in favor of Ukrainian unity and territorial integrity, but on two conditions. One would, once again, be a treaty of neutrality, and the other would be a federal Ukraine, not just the Donbass, but the whole country would essentially be divided into federal units. This, of course, is something which, from the Russian point of view, would then guarantee the position of the Russian language and Russian culture in Ukraine, and would also guarantee that Ukraine would never, in fact, be able to move into a Western alliance. So my sense is that a military campaign would then be made by Moscow the basis for an attempt at a new negotiating process. And while I'm sure, the dominant mood in Washington would be against negotiating on this basis, I think, also in the midst of a tremendous energy crisis and economic crisis, there would be voices in Western Europe which would be willing to negotiate on that basis.
Very good. I want to open the discussion now up to questions from the audience. You have a Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen, so please feel free to use that to submit questions in writing. We have several already, one of which is from Paul Hare, who is of our very own Center for the National Interests. He asks, the Biden administration appears to judge that retreating from NATO or non-NATO ally membership for Ukraine would undermine US credibility among existing US allies. Is that a valid judgment? Do most US allies and partners actually believe that NATO membership should be extended to Ukraine? Might they not instead credit Biden with a pragmatic de-escalatory decision? Who would like to tackle that one? Anatol, you've written on this credibility word.
Well, I have to say, I think we've got ourselves into a ridiculous position over Ukraine, because holding the possibility of NATO membership open has become, a constantly repeated theme of US rhetoric, NATO rhetoric. But at the same time, we have shown in Georgia in 2008, in Ukraine in 2014, and of course have announced recently that Western forces will not fight to defend Ukraine. Now, of course, you could say Ukraine is not now a NATO member, and if it were a NATO member, then maybe we would fight. But the other point about this, of course, is that realistically to commit ourselves to fight for Ukraine would require dispatching to Europe a very large part of the US armed forces. It would require a radical configuration or reconfiguration of European armed forces back towards, the Cold War arrangements, very large heavily equipped land armies configured to fight Russia, to fight Russian tank armies on land. Now, nobody is thinking about that. And of course, from the point of view of the Pentagon, doing something like that in the context of growing rivalry with China is strategically insane. So I think what we've done here is boxed ourselves through our rhetoric, into a position which actually contradicts not just our what we should be doing strategically, but actually what we are doing strategically. And in the end, the credibility of America, morally, legally, militarily, as far as Europe is concerned, involves living up to Article 5 if a NATO member is attacked, which, by the way, I don't believe Russia has any intention of doing. But if at that point America and NATO failed to attack, if one of their members failed to fight, if one of their members were attacked, then our credibility would indeed be shot. It would be over. But making half promises to countries that we do not, in fact, intend to defend, this does not strengthen US credibility. It weakens it.
Cynthia, would you like to comment on this as well?
So I think we can all agree that it was a huge strategic blunder for NATO to put Ukraine in this position of limbo. It wasn't going to be admitted anytime soon, but it also wasn't going to be excluded. And in fact, NATO has been deepening, as has the United States government, its military relations with Ukraine over time. And this is one of the disputes that the objections that Russia has made. So this was a strategic blunder, but just like the strategic blunder of leaving an indefensible West Berlin in the middle of East Germany, it's not something that can be resolved in the middle of a crisis. And that's the credibility problem. The US will never back down now. And that's, I think, one reason why many of us are pessimistic. It would be impossible from the standpoint of domestic politics. This is anti-Russia view is one of the strongest bipartisan domestic points. And even though Europe is divided, you're right, it's many of the West Europeans who have objected to the original Bush administration proposal to bring in Ukraine and have kept it in a situation of limbo. The East Europeans have a very different view to a large extent. And so it's not an issue that's going to be resolved, even though the ideas on how to resolve it, Austria, Finland, are not possible in the immediate future, in my view. But at the same time, we have to admit that Russia has been is now repeating its historical mistake of aggressively pursuing its self-interests and its security interests, even though some might see some of those interests as legitimate. By pursuing them aggressively, the historical error it makes is by galvanizing those in the West to overreact and to take measures that will leave Russia worse off, not better off. And to that, the last thing I would say, I'd point to, look at what's happening now in politics in Finland, right? Which would have been the great country for Ukraine to emulate. how to learn how to cooperate with NATO, harmonize with NATO, but not be so provocative to Russia, to have a strong defense, a strong democracy, a strong economy in a way that didn't require. But now we see some parties in Finland and also in Sweden declaring that their option to join should be left open. So this is just the opposite of what the Russians intend, and it's predictable. So as much as we can agree a stand down is necessary, it's very hard to see how we get to there from here, absent very strong leadership, divorced from politics. And in the US, I think that's a bridge too far right now.
George, could I add something?
Please, Doug.
First of all, I'm in the unfortunate position of having to say I agree with everything that's been said. Having noted that, I would ask people to consider the possibility that when or if this happens, and I think it is likely to occur, at that point, the only way out of this disastrous sort of situation is for the Ukrainians to seize control of their own destiny. That means the Ukrainians, not the Russified Ukrainians, the Ukrainians who live in the West, who are nationalistic and want very much to distance themselves from Russian control and influence, if they can do it, are going to have to get control of their government. They're going to have to do several things, one of which is to give up this ahistorical claim to Crimea, which quite frankly, in the context of history, never made any sense, as Putin and others have pointed out, and they're correct. Secondly, they're going to have to admit that the East that is now under Russian occupation could be an affiliated or at least a neighbor as an independent state, if that's what everyone can agree to. But they've got to determine what it is that they want. I think they've listened far, far too much to us. We've encouraged far too much hostility to Russia. They've got to get along with their neighbor. What kind of state do they want to be? Do they want to be a political football forever between the East and the West? And then finally, based on my personal experience, I don't see a great deal of cohesion in the NATO alliance. I certainly didn't see it 20 years ago or 25 years ago. I think it's quite weak. And I think, frankly, one of the pecuniary externalities of this particular marketplace is that NATO becomes even more meaningless than it already is in a military sense. Whether or not the EU survives, that's another matter. But clearly, I don't think the NATO alliance is the robust and positive and united front that people impute to it, not by a long stretch. So this may be a kind of nail in the proverbial coffin of NATO that's already a heart patient on the table as it is.
And I just add one thought to that. The Swedes could join NATO or could join any other alliance. They still won't fight, nor will the other European members of NATO. And Russia knows that. I mean, that, we do need to keep that firmly in mind. In the last resort, I think Russia is willing to fight, and we are not.
We have a question from David Sanger of the New York Times. It's addressed in particular to Cynthia. He says, are there more innovative non-traditional sanctions under consideration since escalating what we have done already after Crimea, after the 2016 election, after the solar winds episode, is, as you have pointed out, Cynthia, unlikely to work?
Well, the SWIFT is the one that they hold out as the nuclear option. Again, I don't think it's as much a nuclear option against a country that has a very strong bankroll of foreign reserves, a low credit problem, mostly denominated it holds most of its debt like Japan does. So it's less vulnerable. They could sanction the commercial banks like Sberbank and thereby also affect all of the Russian population, not just the banks associated with the Kremlin. But again, Russia has become, and this is why the analogy to China is so important and so interesting, Russia has become more autarkic as a result of the ongoing sanctions to build up its defenses and to become less vulnerable. It will still take a hit. There's just no question about it. It's an international economy. It's a global economy. It will take a hit. But if they go after something like Sberbank, then the risk is of perverse consequences of a different sort. It might encourage the Russian population more to mobilize in support of the regime, to rally around the flag, and make it easier for the Kremlin to blame the West for the hurt that Russian citizens are experiencing. It might also incentivize the Kremlin, Putin in particular. I agree with what was said about Putin not being an extreme nationalist, but it might push him more in that direction, which is not in anyone's interest, but that there would be these perverse consequences. So there are, it's possible they might target Putin himself. There's long been talk about knowing where the money is hidden through different shells. But again, it's not clear that they would do that. How far do they want to go? And to what extent is Washington thinking about retaliation? That's, I would encourage David Sanger and other journalists to ask the administration what happens if they have the strong impact that they seek and deterrence fails and the Russians retaliate. Then what? What is the next step? In a war, one has to plan several steps ahead, not just your first effort to deter. And if deterrence fails, what do you do next when your opponent retaliates?
Right, and just my own comment on that. One of the things that hasn't gotten a lot of attention in the West in the context of Ukraine is the anti-satellite tests that the Russians conducted right in the middle of all this mobilization around Ukraine. Unless we missed the message, a senior Russian military official announced that Russia had the capability of taking out all GPS satellites in the US space constellation, which of course are critical not just to things like precision weapons targeting, but to fundamental day-to-day activities of our society. I don't think it was accidental that the Russians conducted this test and made that announcement in the context of this back and forth over sanctions and counter reactions and that sort of thing. Question from Matt Burrows. The most recent phone call that Presidents Biden and Putin had, one of the things that the Russians noted was that Putin threatened a complete break in the Russian relationship with the United States and the West more broadly. Should we pursue these sanctions from hell that the United States has been threatening? What kind of implications might that have? What would a complete break look like? And would this compel the Russians to pursue a more robust relationship with China than they have to date?
Well, I think the complete break, gets to some of what you just said about them feeling completely unbridled in cyber attacks. I would say, if they did take the step of taking out GPS, I think then you're at a state of war. So it's a little bit more than just completely cutting ties. But I think they will, I do think that Europe is vulnerable here because, one of the things that's happening is that they're looking on how they shift a lot of their gas supply to China, and that obviously means that Europe has to it may be importing U.S. natural gas, but a higher cost or other sources. As I said earlier, I think I'm not sure how far the Chinese want to go in bringing down a lot of more punishment from the U.S. or even from the Europeans. because of really embracing the Russians in this move. I mean, they were pretty, with Crimea, they didn't really go out and endorse it fully, because obviously there's issues on separatism in their own context. It comes, as I was saying before, at a very awkward time, I think, for Xi. But they do have a very close relationship. I think it would grow over time far closer, but there are questions here for, this gets back to, I think, some of Cynthia's point about, how far Russia wants to be dependent on China. There are, Russians I know who are already worried about Russia becoming overly dependent, and obviously as a junior partner to China. So I think that would be one consequence. I think, as I said before, I don't think it pushes us into the Cold War, because the big dynamic is really China-US, and I don't see that, that core part of what we are living through now is changing the, as being the prime factor for where we are headed. But it does mean, I think, that you have China thinking a lot more about maybe there's no way of accommodating the US, and thinking really a lot more than it does already about becoming a lot more self-sufficient.
Mhm.
Can I just add one small point to that?
Sure.
I'm not convinced the Chinese would go or would want to go heavily into Russia's camp if this turns out to be a war scenario. There will continue to be direct support and closer cooperation, but the Chinese, I think, for all the reasons that were said, would want to not get directly involved in the fight. And let's remember one last thing of this. The US has not heavily targeted China with financial sanctions. It has been sanctioning China, but not so much its financial sector, for the obvious reasons it's so much more consequential. And if China moves more heavily in supporting and developing a true alliance with Russia, as one trend line suggests in many areas, but maybe not this far, if Russia goes to war against or escalates the war against Ukraine, then there's already pressure in Congress to increase financial sanctions on China. And so the Chinese are concerned about it and are also trying to harden their economy, but the blowback to the US would be significant. And the consequences for the US role would be significant. So this is a two-way street. It's not just the implications for China. This would have much greater impact on the US role of the dollar going forward if we start to heavily target China with financial sanctions, the way that we're doing already with Russia and threatening to increase.
George, if I could tag on to Cynthia's comments, what comes through with regard to what Cynthia has said, as well as to the other panelists, is that both Putin and I would argue Xi are acutely sensitive to their limitations, which is why you get a very limited offensive in eastern Ukraine, confined to the Russian-speaking areas. And it's also why China is prepared to provide something quietly behind the scenes analogous to Lend-Lease that we did during World War II, starting in July of 41, but not much more. The problem here is that we have no sense of our limitations. And what Cynthia has done is pointed to those. Our limitations are substantial in the financial and economic world. They're also substantial in the military world. We are preeminently a global naval and aerospace power. We are not a continental land power. We are only a land power in the Western Hemisphere. So our ability to influence events on the European continent or the Asian continent is extremely limited. No one seems to want to come to terms with that reality, not even addressing the attitude of the American population, which is significantly unenthusiastic about future conflict in Asia or Europe.
Another question from Paul Hare. He delves a little bit more into the impact on China of all of this. What kind of support do folks think Beijing would offer Moscow in a Ukraine conflict scenario? The Chinese have no interest in military involvement or in letting Moscow destroy the US-China relationship, as Matt has noted. But would they provide diplomatic support for the Russian view that NATO membership for Ukraine is an inherent challenge to Russian security? Thoughts on that? Anatol, I think you're muted.
I think the Chinese would be bound to do that. And by the way, I think that's another reason why the Russians would not try to annex more territory, because for the Chinese, that's a very, very delicate issue, as they showed over Crimea. You know, they're very strong on territorial integrity. But I can't see how the Chinese could permit America to effectively destroy Russia economically. This would be a severe blow to Chinese interest, to Chinese credibility. So I entirely agree. I mean, China is not going to go to war for Russia, nor do I think it's going to send significant military aid, but I can't see how they could fail to provide, you know, very substantial economic and diplomatic support.
Are there not some advantages to the Chinese in a situation in Europe that preoccupies the United States and complicates the ability of the United States to pivot, so to speak, to Asia Pacific over time?
There are colossal advantages, but that, of course, doesn't mean that all of this is being planned in Beijing, or that Beijing, you know, has the ability to encourage that. But I think it would be extraordinary if they didn't take advantage of a military crisis in Europe.
We have a question from John Negroponte, former Director of National Intelligence and US diplomat. He asks, would it be useful to have an in-person face-to-face meeting between Presidents Biden and Putin?
For me, at least, the same applies, only if America goes there with, you know, some concrete things that it's prepared to agree. Because I think that, you know, we're no longer in the 90s when, you know, for Yeltsin, a meeting with the US president was this, you know, wonderful thing in itself. I don't think Putin feels that way anymore. The Russians have made it very clear that they want concrete moves on the part of America.
Matt, any thoughts on this?
Well, you know, one thing is, you know, leadership dynamics, which are very hard to predict, you know, are historically very important. I mean, you see real turning points sometimes when leaders get together. I share Anatol's feeling that, you know, Putin expects something, you know, concrete, just not a meeting. But you know, I think we all share this view that we're not confident that Biden is a leader who can really begin to move, you know, the U.S. domestic scene, his own foreign policy establishment, the allies, towards a true solution that would involve some things like neutrality. But if there is something like that, and maybe, yes, a meeting there could really begin that momentum. You know, one of the big problems here, of course, is the lack of trust. And I would say, you know, at the Biden level, you know, there isn't, there really isn't that. I don't see that kind of dynamic where what you saw with Gorbachev and Thatcher and Gorbachev and Reagan, where they could actually begin to talk reasonably about differences and ways of beginning to narrow that. I just don't see that, but maybe there are things that we don't see at this point.
The Biden administration has also tied its hands to some extent by telling Ukraine, the Ukrainian government, that it won't negotiate above its heads, that it won't deal beyond that. And this is a concern raised in many of the Eastern members of NATO in general. And so did they tie their hands because they want to be firm and encourage Putin to be deterred, or because they're thinking of other actions? I mean, on the one hand, the Biden team has ruled out any kind of direct military participation, although they're offering the pipeline of military support. So this raises a whole set of other questions. Would the US find other ways to participate indirectly, which is just the opposite of finding the solution? As I said, I think it's become harder and harder to envision the kinds of solutions being discussed and raised here. I think we're past that. One can, I think, optimistically point only to the restraint that's been shown in circles, I think, led by the Biden administration and others, not to abrogate the NATO-Russia Founding Act. That is the one area where, if something's going to come out of this, I think it will come out of that. The US continuously points to the fact that it supports the NATO-Russia Founding Act, and whether it continues to do that despite pressure to abrogate it in countries in Europe and elsewhere, to recognize Russia as an aggressor and to cut off all relations with Russia. I think this one sign of restraint is the only hope for building on this. I don't think a bilateral relationship between, or a bilateral meeting between Putin and Biden would bring us any further than the last one did. It won't solve the substantive issues. It does bring a certain amount of prestige to the Kremlin, and that's why it was attacked by conservatives in the United States and elsewhere, but it didn't deliver anything concrete. So if the Russians aren't bluffing, then it's not likely to deliver anything concrete this time either.
So we have time for one more question. It comes from former Defense Department official Joe Bosco, and he proposes what I would call a somewhat out-of-the-box solution. He points out that back in the early 2000s, Putin had broached the possibility of NATO membership for Russia. And he wonders, should NATO invite Russia to join NATO alongside Ukraine today? And I'm going to ask a little bit of a variation on this as well. Could the United States find a way out of this solution by offering Russia membership in a new organization, a new pan-European security organization of some kind that would include Russia as well as Ukraine and others? Is that something that is at all a realistic possibility in all of this?
Shall I
Please.
take the first stab at this? I don't think that NATO membership for Russia is possible for either side. On the Russian side, this would imply lining up with America against China, at least to a limited extent, the limited extent that the Europeans are now doing. Russia dare not do that, given the power of China today and the potential territorial issues in Eastern Siberia. So that's a non-starter. As far as a new European security architecture is concerned, of course, this has been proposed by Medvedev when he was president, the idea of a European Security Council. But it would, I think, from a Russian point of view, have to involve certain also formal guarantees against unilateral action by either side. And that would, in effect, also rule out further expansion of NATO. In other words, the Russians would not go for just another talking shop, or a situation in which the European members of this organizational council would line up and simply shout Russia down, as has happened so often in the past. So we come back again to the fact that formal moves of this kind, I believe now, have to be accompanied by concrete steps, and as we've heard from Cynthia and others, that is very difficult.
George, for what it's worth, the only organization that Russians seem to be prepared to take seriously at any point in time, based on my personal experience with Russian military, was OSCE. They tended to regard the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe as a potentially fair and objective player. But again, I think if the Russians do what I'm convinced they probably will, and they move to the Dnieper River, we live in a new world at that point. I think we'll see more changes and repositioning inside Europe, particularly in Western Europe as well as Eastern Europe, that will change the whole calculus. And I'm not sure that at the end of the day, our leadership will be taken very seriously anymore.
All right, well, I want to thank all our panelists. This has been a very fascinating, wide-ranging discussion, one that I think we're going to have to continue in the coming weeks and hopefully months, should we not wind up into some sort of decisive outcome prior to then. I'm George Beebe, Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for the National Interest. Thank you to our audience. I look forward to our next event.